Today's presenter, Russell Jackman, is a graduate of the McGeorge School of Law, University of Pacific, and was admitted to the State Bar of California in June of 1994. He has been vice chair of the California State Bar's Law Practice Management and Technology Committee and a member since 1996. He works specifically with law offices and attorneys that need to get the most out of their legal technology and creates PowerPoint presentations for opening statements, direct examinations, and closing statements to be used in court, and can work with attorneys directly to filter their documents and images so that they have the most powerful visual presentations possible. He also works with law offices and solo attorneys to upgrade their older systems to new ones, troubleshooting existing setups, and training attorneys and staff on Microsoft programs. He is available for remote access consulting on technology-related issues, so please feel free to contact him at any time.
Based in Marin County, California, Ginny Kuhel is an experienced human resources business consultant with a demonstrated history of working in the human resources industry. Skilled in various training modules, she is an expert in sexual harassment training, communication, management, labor law compliance, interviewing techniques, plus employee policies and procedures. She is a Marin NLP master practitioner and life transition coach. Marin NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, provides education and experience that supports the conscious growth of everyone in our community and beyond. NLP is an internationally known and sought-after leader in innovation and transmission of original contemporary teachings and applications. Ginny Kuhel may be reached at kuhlbreeze@gmail.com. That's KUHELBREEZ @gmail.com, or through LinkedIn. Just enter Ginny Kuhel, GINNYKUHEL, and send her an invitation, and I'm sure she'll be happy to discuss whatever issues you may have.
Hello, my name is Russell Jackman, and welcome today to our talk on human resources about sexual harassment and workplace violence. And one of the reasons that we're here today and speaking is because this is something that's important for all attorneys to know about. Given Rule 1.1 from the model rules of the ABA in the area of competence, it says that a lawyer shall not recklessly, with gross negligence, or repeatedly fail to perform legal services with competence. For purposes of this rule, competence in any legal service shall mean applying the learning and skill, mental, emotional, and physical ability reasonably necessary for performance of such service. So what we're talking about when we talk about workplace violence and sexual harassment is being able to manage your workplace correctly so that the mental, emotional, and physical ability that is reasonably necessary for performance of such skill and service can be accomplished correctly, because if you're not adhering to the rules for workplace violence and sexual harassment, you won't be able to perform correctly in the workplace, nor will the people you work with or clients and so forth. Now, the one thing that's important about this is that there's also Rule 1.1c, which is that if a lawyer does not have sufficient learning and skill when legal services are undertaken, the lawyer can nonetheless provide competent representation by associating with, or where appropriate, professionally consulting with another lawyer whose lawyer reasonably believes to be competent, or acquiring such skill, or referring the matter to another lawyer whom the lawyer reasonably believes to be competent. So what Rule 1.1 1C says is that if you don't understand the laws of sexual harassment and workplace violence, you find someone who's an expert who can help educate you in that. So to that, I have gotten Ginny Kuhel of Cold Breeze Human Resources to help us. She does human resource consulting, and she understands that running a modern day law office is more than just going to court and writing briefs. Being able to manage people that work for the law office and the day-to-day issues that come up while making sure that everything gets filed correctly, the client's needs are being managed correctly, funds are being taken care of correctly, and all the bills are paid to keep the lights on. Most attorneys would agree that one of the highest challenges and greatest challenges today in running a law office smoothly is managing its human resources. So today, I want to talk to Ginny about things that she knows and has experienced with law offices and other businesses in regards to sexual harassment and preventing workplace violence. Ginny, can you explain a little bit more about your services?
Okay, yes. Thank you, Russell. Yeah, in my services, what I always say is I'm kind of A to Z in human resources. I have about 30 years in human resources working in corporations and privately. And so some of my services is onboarding, which is proper paperwork, which I find a lot of businesses don't have. Do a lot of hiring and interviewing because it's a little difficult right now to find employees. A lot of what I handle for many companies is conflict resolution because that's coming up a lot. Terminations and the importance of documentation. Also workman's comp. People have an injury in the workplace, employers aren't sure how to handle it. And what I love the most is training in different areas, sexual harassment, workplace violence, communication. And a lot of times it's just to advise the owners on how to handle concerns in the workplace because they need to handle their business. And I tell them, I'll handle your HR.
Great. Can you explain about some of your experience of working with law offices in the past?
Well, yeah, I've had a couple different law offices, non-employment law, because that's what I specialize in. And in those areas, some of the challenges that I see there are mostly what's the timesheets and how you track your time, because there is the having to have time correctly based on billable hours. And the frustrations I'm hearing from attorneys is that the hourly employees are not tracking their time correctly, and so they don't know how to bill their clients. Now, that's one issue. And then also it is imperative that on a timesheet that they have a place where they have a meal break by the 5th hour, and that's all hourly employees. And so if they don't get the meal break, then you have to pay them 1 hour of regular pay at the end of the day. And just for emphasis, one of the biggest court cases is what's called wage and hour. And these all have to do with meal breaks and employees saying that they're not getting them. The employer saying yes, or the attorney saying, yes, we did. But if there's no documentation, it never happened. So that's one thing to remember. You got to document or it didn't happen.
And what is your advice on creating that documentation? Are there computer programs that people can use for that, or what is the best way to make sure that that documentation occurs?
Well, there in the attorneys firms that I've worked with, everybody seems to have a different one. Some people have time cards, which is old. Some have timesheets, and some have computer programs. The thing to control is when they're doing their sheets or program is to make sure that you're looking at it on a regular basis. And I would say, if you have a new employee, look at it daily. If it's older employees, weekly. Make sure that the time is in there so you don't have to wait to every payroll, or when there becomes a problem, is to check to make sure things are documented correctly. If they're not documented the way that the firm wants it, what you need to do is I call train. And this is what I had to tell people. Show them what you want. Tell them why you want it. Sometimes employees, if they understand why it has to be there and correct, they can do their timesheets or computer programs better. And if they don't, and it keeps happening, which I've had, is then you have to discipline. if you don't discipline somebody, if you've been training and telling them what to do and they still are consistently not doing it, then you discipline them and have a consequence. If there's no consequence, the behavior is going to continue. It doesn't mean you have to be mean about it. You just have to discipline and write them up.
Now, do you find that a lot of law offices lack a coherent written policy when it comes to something like this, that they don't really have a structure for it?
It varies on the size of the company. I would say the smaller firms, which I work with a lot, don't generally have policies and procedures because one, it's very time consuming and the laws are consistently changing. So my suggestion is to find somebody wherever you're is that can help you in keeping these policies and keeping them up to date. But yeah, I find a lot of businesses are just not adhering to, especially the breaks. And that's a big concern.
And what are the penalties that happen if they don't adhere to the break, allowing their employees to have breaks, or their timing isn't good?
Okay, so what happens with meal breaks? Penalties vary on whatever the infraction is somewhere, but generally, if you're not giving them the meal breaks, it depends on when it goes to a court. If it goes that far, then you have to go back and pay all the past wages on that. And who knows how far back it goes. And what's happening is a lot of times these cases are going into class action. So people get together and then do a class action, and then court cases, you know, it so varies, but by the time you pay for the attorney and the court, you're looking at a minimum $30,000 to $50,000, depending on, is it 1 or is it 10 or is it 100? Then you're getting into $500,000. It's very expensive. Once there's an infraction, it's better to be proactive than reactive.
So, what would you say would be a good way to manage the time that employees are spending? Like, for example, when I was, I also did HR law work for for a major used car business, Paul Blanco. And we were always having HR issues when it came to the signing in and out of people for lunch. People would not sign out for lunch. Then they would leave work early and say that they worked lunch at their desk, and they would then keep the lunch hour and make that something that they would work into overtime, because they would say they didn't take lunch, then they worked through lunch. That wound up turning into overtime for them, which the company was saying, you should have taken your lunch when we told you to, and not work through lunch and not turn that into overtime. So have you seen that issue?
Absolutely. And that's correct. This is what happens a lot in all kinds of businesses. Once again, by the law, now here in California, all the laws are different in different states. You have to pay them if they're working. Okay. So if somebody worked through their lunch, you're going to have to pay them, and you're going to have to pay them for their lunch break. Now it's regular pay, not overtime. And it's again, going through and making sure that they're following the policies. It's what I call the discipline or policy procedures. Here's the meal break policies. We need you to adhere to this. This is what it is. And if you can't, then we need to talk about that later. And that's when you start the verbal warning and the disciplinary warnings and what's going to be the consequence, because it's going to start getting costly.
And that's back to from me to you, is a question is, what should the consequence be? What is an appropriate consequence to put in for someone that continuously works through lunch breaks, and you tell them you need to take them at a specific time, and not either take too long or take too short of a time? You know, you've got to take the half hour that we're giving you, or you have to take the hour that we're giving you. What's the best consequence in something like that?
And it will vary by the company, but you know, if you have someone who's consistently following policy, and you've done a verbal warning, you've done 2 disciplinary warnings, then you give them a final warning, you have to decide whether you want to terminate them. And I'm finding a lot of people don't want to terminate because they said, well, I can't find anybody to replace them. But what's the consequence to the business? You keep having this behavior that's being costly to the employer, to the attorneys or the firms. And it's probably not the only thing that this person is having an infraction on. Someone who is not following the rules and regulations on a consistency basis, as you've been talking to them, is usually having an absentee problem, or there's someone that might be disgruntled at work. There's usually more than one thing going on. And so my question always to that is, do you want to keep this person, and why do you want to keep them? And know that you have a risk. How much risk are you willing to take, and how much cost are you willing for the company to pay out because of somebody's mistake?
Very good. Now, are there things that you see when you consult with law offices that you see that's common, but you feel that a lot of law offices overlook as far as their HR is concerned?
I don't know about common.
In other words, a blind spot, something that law offices have that's kind of a blind spot to them. They're not seeing something that you think other companies are more aware of, but law offices are not paying attention to.
Okay, here's the struggle that I have with law offices is there's a resistance from attorneys to follow the state or federal laws. A lot more than what I see with other businesses. I think it's because sometimes the law office feels there should be an exception, or there might be a loophole, or, that doesn't affect me here. And because they're aware of certain laws, not employment law, they think that there's a loophole to it. And in most laws, there's not a loophole. So that's that's what I find is the resistance is, yes, I know I'm supposed to do this. I know I'm supposed to have them have a meal break or whatever, but I don't really want to do that.
And why do you think that they do this? I mean, do you think that it winds up costing them more in the end when they try to shortcut this?
I don't think the consequences are looked at. And I thought about this. I'm trying to think of an attorney firm that I worked with, and it was just like, well, we don't want to do that. And it's another thing I have is that they want to put all employees as exempt employees, which means they're all salaried and not hourly. Well, that doesn't work. In California, again, you have to have 2 different categories. And they said, but it's much easier. Then I don't have to worry about overtime. Well, that's not what the law is. And so I've had the biggest struggle saying, well, you have to make this individual an hourly employee because there's a special test through exemption and non-exemption that you have to follow. And that's another big law case, because what's happening in firms is, well, I'm going to make everyone exempt. I don't have to pay overtime. Well, the laws, they want people on hourly to get their taxes, obviously. And so hourly employees don't always want to be salaried. So that's a big concern too that I've seen in law firms.
And what is can you explain to the listener or the viewer what the difference is in California, at least, between the independent contractor and an employee, and how that law is probably going to spread across the United States before too long, I think.
Oh, talking about AB 5 for independent
Yes.
contractors. Yes. Okay. There's a thing called ABC. And so what it is an independent contractor. The main thing is the independent contractor cannot be doing the business. So for example, I am hired by a law firm to do HR. I'm not doing attorney work, so I can be a contractor. So, okay, and they want to hire a paralegal. We won't only want this person in part-time, so we're going to make them a contractor. No, the paralegal is doing the business. And there's another thing where you also have to have your own business and a license. And this is what I've heard. Well, this paralegal has their own business and a license. Yes, but there's 3 categories. They cannot be doing your business. So if they're doing bookkeeping or administration or something like that, that's fine, but they cannot be doing the law. If they're doing anything that's the business, they must be an employee.
That's an interesting concept, but I'm still a little unfamiliar with it. What do you mean by doing the business? What's the?
Okay, so if I'm a paralegal, I'm doing legal work.
Uh-huh.
If I'm working, and just not with attorneys, here's just another example, which I had a lot of when this law came in. I own a Pilates studio and I'm bringing in teachers to teach Pilates. They're teaching Pilates. They're doing the business. They're not doing the books. They're not an HR person. They're teaching Pilates. They're teaching yoga. In the attorney, it's the paralegal. Anyone that's having to do the work in the business, like someone who's doing admin work and is not doing any legal work, they could be a contractor. But you have to watch when it slides over to doing any kind of attorney work or what the business per se is.
That is interesting.
Clear?
Not at all. So
Okay.
I think that'll probably lead to quite a few lawsuits because I'm not.
Oh, it's big out there, and a lot of people, and this is what I hear. I don't care. I said, I just need to, here's what I need to tell you the law. What you do with it is your business, but be careful.
And what are you finding that attorneys are doing with that advice that you give them?
I tell them, don't tell me. Because if you're my client, or if you're my client and I know this is going on, I really can't keep you as a client, because it's my responsibility to adhere to the California law. That's what my job is. And I'm very rule oriented and I stick to the rules. So if you're not wanting to follow the laws, then I have a hard time keeping you as a client. I have worked with some people who said, well, I'm going to be turning them over in a couple months. I said, fine, at least I know you're, now, do they? I don't know, but at least they're working towards that. It's a huge problem here in California. Huge.
Speaking of huge problems, let's talk a little bit about sexual harassment in the workplace,
Okay.
workplace violence, which is what we're mostly here for. But what you told me was very important to understand the framework in which we're discussing everything.
What you could do is go on Google and look up AB5, and that's California. I don't know if it's in other states, and it'll explain, or look up ABC. It's called ABC with, and it'll explain what it is a little more in depth. But yeah, it's still going on. So,
Nice.
All right, sexual harassment. And the reason I talk about sexual harassment along with violence in the workplace is because the issues with sexual harassment can be a catalyst of violence in the workplace. So a little bit about sexual harassment is that it's not just sexual, it's hostile work environment and bullying is huge in the workplace right now. And harassment, it could be verbal, it could be visual or physical. So it's not just physical. Right now, sexual harassment is required for employees with 5 or more, and it's only in 9 states. But here's what I say: employees from any state can put a claim in, and it happens in any state and around the world. So even whether you have training or not, it doesn't matter. And the federal court decisions for years have shown that employers who do not train all their employees may lose their ability to avoid punitive damages in a harassment lawsuit. Court cases are huge in sexual harassment. And then also many lower courts have ruled that avoiding punitive damage is to make sure that employers provide training. And that doesn't mean if it's a requirement, just provide training. There's a lot of training, and there's a website on, and it's free training through the government. I wouldn't say it's the best training, but at least you'll get an idea. And then I also like to go, and there's 2 kinds. And then when people hear about sexual harassment, it's that quid pro quo, means this for that, which means that an employer will make a decision based on Some grant or deny an unwelcome romantic or sexual favor. So if a supervisor is saying, okay, a condition of your hiring is, you have to go out with me, or let's go to dinner, and it has to do with, I'm going to promote you or I'm not going to promote you. And over the years, this has become really big. And I noticed in Ohio that there was a Ohio gymnastic coach had 100 cases against him for touching, things like that. Also, sexual harassment is kind of slowing down a little, but hostile workplace is on the rise. And so what I like to tell people, you have to understand an hostile work environment, it's unwelcome, and it has to do with severe and pervasive conduct, but you don't know if the person wants to be hugged. You don't know what a joke is going to be. You don't want to be blocking someone because you don't know that person. Maybe people don't like to be hugged. I like to talk about bullying because it's huge now, and it can lead to workplace violence. And some of the statistics is 75% of employees have witnessed workplace bullying behavior. That's huge. And then 62% of that, generally, if they've been bullied, they resign. And it's funny because the person who has been bullied, 70% of the time they stay. And it's usually the supervisor, more than coworkers. And unfortunately, 60% are females. So it's important that if you see this behavior going on, and I'll go over a little bit, is to be aware of it and do something about it as soon as possible. And then I also like to talk about the negative consequences of bullying or hostile work environment, because I think it just has to do with that. There's a lot of things to watch for. And this is, again, where we're going to get into workplace violence, is there's the anxiety, there's panic attacks, depression comes on, PTSD diagnosis, people have flashbacks. I mean, sleep disorder, hypertension, there's so many things that happen, so that when you put that stress onto someone and they come back into the workplace, you don't know what's going to happen in the future. People ask me about, well, there's a lot of remote going on, so it's probably not as much in the workplace. No, I have found statistics showing that bullying from remote workers is up around 59%. That's huge. You have it in group meetings, there's private meetings, there's group emails and private emails. So that's a lot for people thinking that there's no bullying going on. And what we forget is when we're on Zoom is people can see our face, they can see our reactions, and it's really important to watch your behavior on Zooms. And when I tell people there is proper etiquette in emails, because a lot of times people are yelling and screaming and swearing in emails. And just so the attorneys know, anything that's in writing can be used in court. So if somebody has a court case against you, they're going to pull up all those emails. And the attorney, the employment attorney will get all those emails and find documentation on it. So that's just a brief thing on sexual harassment. But the court cases, what I like to say a little bit about California is, California has 46% more court cases because we have a lot more laws. But when you think about what's happening in the workplace, it's not just the cost of going to court, it's what they call the loss of productivity. So there's loss of productivity. There's $2.6 billion a year in loss of productivity in the workplace due to hostile work environment, bullying, violence in the workplace. And so that's a huge cost to a company. A company just, when you have to have these court cases, they're time consuming. And I'm seeing a lot of the hostile work environments are coming like $500,000 to $1 million. That's a lot of money. If you had have just stopped and listen, here's the thing, listen if somebody has a concern right away. That is the key. You stop everything. As an HR consultant, well, actually, when I was an HR director in a company, if somebody came into my office and had a complaint, I stopped everything. And one example is that I actually had someone come in my office who was waving a piece of paper saying discrimination. Now, of course, I stopped everything. Now, I knew there was something else going on, and I know this sounds like a long time. He was in my office 3 hours pacing because he was going to get an attorney. He was going to go to the labor commissioner. He felt, and he did have reasons to. He was in a construction company, and he was Caucasian, and a lot of times construction is more Hispanic. 3 hours later, we were buds, and there was no court case. So is 3 hours a long time to listen? Yes, but not as costly as if he had gone to the labor commissioner. So that's just my advice, is listen and have no agenda when they come in. That's the thing. People really want to be heard. I've probably done over 500 conflict resolutions, and most of the time they just want respect and to be heard. So this is important. Also with sexual harassment, I don't know about other states, but here in California, if somebody states that there's something going on or hostile or whatever, you must investigate. You can't just say, well, we'll look into it later. And if you're going to court, the attorney for the other side is going to wonder, when did you start the investigation? So the sooner you start, the better for you and having lower court costs. Anything else you want on that?
Yeah, because this is a situation that we encountered in the place where I was, which is that sometimes what happens is a big time either attorney or sales guy or something like that is one of the ones that commits the harassment, and the ownership is it, or the partners are in a situation where they say, well, this guy he won us a case, or this lady won us a case for $1 million, and they're the face of the business, and everybody knows who they are, and they're a good salesperson or what have you, and so they are in the choice of trying to get rid of somebody who, until the harassment claim came up, they considered a productive member, or someone that was like a big earner or a big name, that commits the harassment. And the person that was harassed is somebody that's minor, that maybe was only hired a few months ago or something like that. And now in the case of Paul Blanco, they made the wrong choice, and I advised them not to, but they made the wrong choice to keep that employee on and just transfer him to a different office. That was their idea of solving the problem. And I said, that's not going to solve the problem, because he's just going to commit it somewhere else. And of course he did. But what do you do with places and companies or firms that have somebody that they think is important that commits the harassment, and they have to make a choice between getting rid of one of their big earners or disciplining one of their big earners, or having to sweep this under the rug and hope it goes away? What do you have to say about that?
Well, it's interesting because I do hear that a lot, and it's like, well, that's just John being John, and you brush it off. Nowadays with the Me Too movement, it's not good. I mean, years ago that was fine. I mean, I was subject to it years ago when there weren't many laws, but now it's really sticky. It depends on the person making the complaint. So here's what I would do. If it came, a lot of times what you do is, if something's coming up, if somebody has an HR person on board, is to bring it to their attention. Okay, that's number one. I usually will bring somebody in and listen to what's going on, because I always find when you're listening to two things, it's one person says one thing and one person says another thing. It's usually something in between. So, what went on? Does the person have an example? Was there a date on it? Did anyone see it? That's important. If anybody saw the behavior. Now, then I'll get into what do you do. So you have to investigate. You have to look into the behavior. If it's true and people have seen it, then it's probably been going on and nobody wants to say anything because it's a bigwig. That's a problem. I wish I had an easy answer, because what happens, they usually want to let the person making the complaint gone. If
Correct.
that happens, okay, if that happens, maybe 7 out of 10 times nothing's going to happen, but then that other 3% going, no, I'm going to the labor commissioner and I'm going to an attorney. So now the firm that the bigwig's at, it depends on what happened in the company. Did they investigate it at all? If this, say it was happening to me and I got an attorney. So I get myself an employment attorney. This went on. I went to human resources. I went to manager. Nothing happened. There were witnesses that it's gone on, and I've heard he's always done this. So then they start taking the case and they do a huge investigation. And then they may find out, well, you did nothing about it. If you haven't done anything about it, it could be a very large court case. That's one option. You do have to ask the person. Another scenario is, once you get the complaint, if you talk to the attorney, which is very uncomfortable, is find out from this person. Maybe, here's something I said to the person making the complaint. Did you tell them to stop? You know, did you explain to them that it made you uncomfortable? And a lot of times I hear from people going, well, you know, they're a big wig and I can't do that, or they're the CFO. And I said, but then they don't know. Let's say it's as simple as a hug. Okay. I don't mind them, but you have to ask. And some people, they don't want to be touched. So I said, well, did you tell them that makes you uncomfortable? So then if they didn't, then if you go to the attorney and say, hey, I just want to let you know that, someone saw, or, you know, we had a little complaint or an issue with you hugging so-and-so. Did you know about that? And now there's two scenarios. One, I had no idea. I never even thought about it. I do it with everybody. I'm so sorry. I won't do it again. That's one scenario. The other one is where you have people going, oh, just buck up. You know, this is who I am, and they're going to have to accept me. Now you have a problem. And the bigger problem is, what do you do with that? Can the company afford, here's the risk, not to pay attention to it? And it's generally the question I ask. What risk are you willing to take? Will this person go to the labor commissioner and get an attorney? I don't know. If they do, it's going to cost you. So are you willing to pay out $1 million for the court case, as well as time and everything else? So that's a question that the company has to ask themselves, number one. And if the productive attorney, it's just not okay behavior. And so what will happen is, if you do the investigation and you find out it's going on, then you have to come up with a solution for the complaining party of, this is what's happened. You have to give them a resolution. So we're going to do this. We're going to give him training. We've talked to him about this. If this occurs again, please let us know. But please let him know that that behavior is not acceptable. Okay. That is the hardest thing to tell somebody. Is that clear?
Yeah, that is. And let's move on, because I know you have a lot more
yeah.
stuff you got to cover.
Oh, yeah. So do you want to go over workplace violence, or what else? Okay.
Please.
So now we're going to go into a little bit on workplace violence. And this is a law that came up in California and 9 other states as of July 1st of this year. So I'm going to go a little bit on workplace violence, then I'm going to go what's happening into the plan. The reason I want to go over it, because like sexual harassment, even though you don't have to put a plan together, there are many states that are looking into this, that was going to be putting it in the next year. So it's important to look at what's happening in the workplace. Again, if you don't have to have training, it doesn't mean that workplace violence is not going to happen in your state. So it's awareness. And I keep telling awareness, awareness, and awareness. Be aware. So a little bit on workplace violence. It's hard to believe that 2 million American workers are victims of workplace violence each year. So this is why have a plan, okay? And it can strike anywhere, and no one's immune. So it doesn't matter if you have a training program or whatever. And generally, unfortunately, again, 73% of the violence is coming for females, and it's usually between age 25 and 54. Now, there are specific industries that are happen more, like we're talking to attorneys, but it can happen in your office, but it's generally 76% is healthcare and socially assisted industries. Think about restaurants or any service, retail, your banks, things of that sort. So OSHA, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, says it lands into 4 categories. There's criminal intent, and then you have customer and client. And that's one thing I wanted to mention also with sexual harassment and hostile work environment. It's not just the people in your office. As the attorney firm, you are responsible for your employees and safe employees, for any vendor coming in, any of your clients, anyone. You are responsible for keeping the workplace safe. So if you have a vendor come in and they're doing sexual harassment, or I mean they're hostile to someone, it's your responsibility to investigate that. I meant to mention that. And then your worker on workers and personal relationships. And that meaning there's a lot of domestic violence, and what's happens, the domestic violence can come into the workplace. Some of the root causes is a company merger. That brings a lot of stress to the company, or a job layoff, being fired. In my capacity of human resources, I've had to terminate and fire a number of people. And there's a lot of stress going on with that, because they're losing their job. There's no money income. Any demotion, when you get a disciplinary action, it doesn't mean that they agree with your disciplinary action. So these are the things that you have to be aware of, that it may be a cause for some kind of violence in the workplace. And of course, the most common is among coworkers. So you have one coworker who's, more aggressive towards someone else. I'm not going to go over changes of behavior and how to be aware of that. And then the high percentage are perpetrated by individuals outside the workplace. If you've ever heard of certain incidences where somebody's been fired, or they've been, something is going on in the home and they're no longer at their job, and unfortunately they get guns and come into the workplace. And this is more common than you think. So I was in one organization where we were checking, security checking everything. Just know that you have the right to check desk drawers, anything that comes in the workplace, and we found a gun. So does that mean that person's going to use it? We don't know. But you have to terminate someone on that. Workplace violence. See, we talked about this harassment. A lot of that intimidation, when you're intimidating somebody. We talked about bullying and the sexual harassment. Stalking, that's another thing. It's horrible, the stalking, when somebody's like following you, or somebody may have a problem with you at work and then they start stalking you outside of the workplace. I was a victim of stalking for 2 years, and I'll tell you, it was horrible, and you have to have police around you all the time. Domestic violence that comes into the workplace. There's a problem at home. What's happening in some of the incidences that I've studied is men, well, it's usually women, but the men will come and they'll start pacing around the building. They'll start coming into your workplace. Now, you as the owner of that firm have got to be aware of these things going on, because it can escalate once it's in the workplace. And to be quite honest, they're saying there's no specific profile. It's just, it has to do with emotions and things going on. Here's what we talk about. It's a good predictor of future behavior is what past behavior. If you see somebody that's aggressive, or in domestic violence, you see someone that's coming into your workplace that has bruises or things of that sort, that's awareness. The main thing is to be aware of what's going on, not just to say, well, I don't want to get into it, it's personal, because you don't know if it's going to be coming in. And then the change is if you're seeing someone that's usually very socially interactive and now becomes withdrawn or detached. Do you see someone who's usually happy and all of a sudden they're depressed and they don't want to talk, or someone who's usually so soft-spoken is now starting to yell? Why? Why is this occurring? And then you're going to have to figure out, be aware, managers, owners, your firms, your attorneys, be aware of this behavior because something is going on and you want, as I mentioned before, be proactive rather than reactive. Because what happens is when there is something like that, or if there's verbal aggression, our normal tendency is to do fight or flight. So we want to either run or we want to fight. So we have to be careful and we have to really calm ourselves. In some of the positions, say in human resources, of course, people have come into my office when I was in corporation is yelling and screaming. Now, if I yell and scream back, what I'm doing is escalating it rather than just, I would consciously tell myself, quiet and listen, because you can only have an argument with one person. If you're yelling and if you're not yelling back, eventually it decreases. But again, it's listening. Again, you're maintaining your composure. But they always say, can't always resolve the conflict, but you can manage it. And I can't say enough is listen, listen, listen. Don't talk. Let them do the talking. You can ask questions and hopefully de-escalate it by showing concern about it rather than getting whirled up into the anger. Then you have two people who are now angry at each other rather than saying, oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Your last point is if drugs and alcohol are involved, the risk of violence increases by 95%. What rights or what abilities do law firms have to mandate drug and or alcohol testing in that instance?
If they feel there's a workplace violence going on or prior. In other words,
prior, if there's suspicion, but they don't know, or there's been an allegation, but there's no proof of it.
Okay. You can, there's two different things. You can test when people are first hired, you can test them, but then you have to test everybody. It can't be discriminatory. A lot of times
and it's no longer, you're no longer capable of testing for marijuana now, are you?
Not really. But you don't, and this is what I tell, the firms is that just because marijuana is legal doesn't mean they could smoke it before or in work hours. Every handbook I write says no smoking of marijuana prior or during any work hours. It would be like drinking a drink before you come into work. You can't do that.
But marijuana testing can show up to 2 weeks of use.
Absolutely.
So you don't have any proof that somebody is high at that point in time.
No,
testing.
Not really, but you can usually smell it. I mean, I had someone who said, yeah, they were smelling before they come in. I said, if you smell it, you can tell them you can send them home.
Interesting.
Oh, you can send somebody home. Absolutely. If you feel somebody's been drinking. Now, an example, I worked in a construction company and a lot of times people would drink at night, but in construction, think about it. You're perspiring a lot, so it would come out. So I don't know if they were drinking on the job or was before. So I had to come up with a plan and talk with the individual and state, I don't know if this is happening on the job, but the client has complained about this. Let's come up with some solutions on that. How can we handle that? I didn't accuse them because I hadn't seen them. If you're smelling alcohol, is it someone perspiring and it's from the night before? Are they drinking before? It's again, being aware of the behavior, and you could bring someone in and just talk. You can't say, are you doing drugs? Because you don't know. How are things going? Just I kind of go round about it. Anything I need to know about what's going on? Most of the time they're going to say no. And it's a risk. I don't know how else because you can't blame someone or say that you're drinking if you haven't seen it. I mean, you can
Okay.
smell it, but how do you know if somebody's on cocaine? I don't know. And maybe they're hyper, but it's very tricky. But again, if you're watching, if you saw someone who was, like I said, calm before, and all of a sudden they're coming in and they look like they've been drinking, maybe their words are off, here, work production. So if somebody's doing drugs or alcohol, they'll find that their work is probably not as good. Now you can discipline on that, saying, this is what's happening. So this is happening here. We're going to do a performance improvement plan. We need to have these things improved by this date. If it doesn't, we may need to look about your employment here. That's a lot how you can get someone out if you don't know what's going on, is if their work is not up to par.
Okay.
Okay. Here's behaviors that we've talked about. Behaviors. If you see behaviors that are disruptive, aggressive, hostile, emotional changes in behavior, if you see the prolonged anger or holding grudges, preoccupation with violent themes. I mean, you wouldn't be bringing things into the workplace if you see anyone that's got any kind of, I know they're allowed to read what they want on their lunch hour, but you don't want things in their desk on guns and things of that sort. You can ask them not to bring them in. What companies and firms don't understand is once somebody comes into their workplace, they have a right to say what that person can have. You can check, like I said, their desks, lockers, purses, briefcases, once they come into the building, because now they're in your business. So people don't understand that, but you can. That's a law. Well, here in California it is. And then the highly sensitivity to criticism. Not everybody likes it, but if you have somebody and you're criticizing them for something, depending on your mood, if they're very sensitive, they start screaming. These are things to be aware of. Now, I want to talk a little bit, because this is the plan for California and 9 other states. What you have to do is, these are the requirements. You must create a workplace violence prevention plan. You have to incorporate what they call the Injury Illness Prevention Program requirements. What Cal OSHA or OSHA calls is the IIPP. All businesses here in California and probably some states are required to have what's called a safety manual, IIPP. So this has to do with all the safety issues in the company. How do you handle attorney firms must have it too. And this is what happens in case of an emergency. So you put this workplace violence plan into that. And there's a lot of requirements. It is a tedious process to put the plan together. You have to train your employees. That's one of the requirements. And you have to have employee input. So you have to talk to the employees about this plan and how can they help the business, and who's going to be in charge of the training. And this plan has to be done with every new hire that comes in, has to look at the plan. It has to be done in July if you have one now for everybody, and then annually. So it's always annually. And then you must record the incidents of violence and properly maintain records. Once again, who's checking the records? No one until something happens. And then once it happens, if you don't have the proper records, that's when you have the government agency, which would be OSHA or Cal OSHA, coming in and looking at all your documentation. And if you don't have it, then there's fines. A lot of times they'll give you a chance to correct it. But I looked up the fines. If there's a serious infraction, it can be around $25,000 for each infraction. And if there's something willfully, in other words, we didn't want to do it and stuff like that, it's like 150,000 plus. So there are fines if you don't have it. So very important to maintain proper records. Who is covered? And this is California and probably the other 9 states. It would be every employer with one or more. There are a few exceptions. And those if the employees telework from a location of their own choosing outside of the control of the employer. So if you have all of your employees are telecommuting, you don't need a plan. If you have a location that's not open to the public, where there's fewer than 10 employees, you don't have to have a plan, but the public cannot come in. And a lot of my clients are asking me, do I need this? And I said, well, do vendors come in? Do you have mailman come in? Do you have, if they do, it's open to the public. The only way this is okay is if your doors are totally closed and nobody comes in except for the employees and that work there. And of course, Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, they already have it. So those are who are covered at the moment. And I always say this, especially here in California, is at the moment. Laws change constantly. And for other states, your attorney firms, check your laws. Just go Google and put, if you're in Virginia, sexual harassment laws, Virginia, paid sick leave laws, Maryland, just put your state and then what the law you're looking for and always put in the current year, 2024, because they do change. And then this just goes more in detail. I don't know, time frame. Russell, do we want to go through
Yeah,
this?
you've got about 8 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So what you do in creating the workplace violence plan, it's a written plan. It must be written. You have to train your employees and your supervisors on violence matters. And that means you have to have the log, you keep the records. It's incorporating what I mentioned into the injury illness prevention program. And what that is it's communicating occupational safe and healthy matters. So in the IIPP, there you have to have trainings, you have to have written communication, you have to have committees. It's all in keeping the workplace safe for the employee. You have to conduct periodic inspections. This is for the workplace violence. So just equipment, what's happening, who's coming in, anything that's new or any new hazard. And then you have to provide the employee with an opportunity to examine and receive a copy of this reports. And then it's no later than 5 days after the request, which is pretty quick. Training employees, which you mentioned. Let's see. Train initially and then annually after that. How to report, you have to teach them. How do you report it? Having courses, I'm putting together a course on workplace violence that I will be training employees in different companies on stuff we've been talking about today. How do you recognize it? This is what needs to be in your plan. What are their duties? And then how do you implement that? And then if you need assistance to prevent or respond to the violence. So employees need to know what to do and have a log. You have to record the incidences, and that's, no personal information. Okay. You're recording the incident and then other information, but not the person or their address. And you maintain the records and you keep those records for 5 years and save for at least a minimum of 1 year. Those that have safety incidences in their companies, you basically keep it for 30 years. So this is safety incidences if you have a fall. You can get more information if you wanted more information on this at https://OSHA and just look into workplace violence. Okay, and it'll give you information on that. Just a little more on how to prevent violence in the workplace starts with good communication. We talked about this, training your employees, having safety meetings to discuss how to handle a violent situation and be aware of the changes in behavior. Try to de-escalate. And then again, maintaining your composure, and you ask and listen. There are things that how to respond to this. And a lot of the police are saying, again, you're being aware. You're figuring out what's going on. Is there sounds? Is there yelling? Is there, are people bringing in backpacks? And I always say, trust your instincts. If you think so, your instincts are pretty good. Report it. In extreme violence, what they say is get out and run, hide, and call the authorities. What's interesting on this is you silence your phones, because if there's somebody, say someone's coming into your workplace with a gun or whatever, you want to silence your phone because then they can find you. Also, one of the tips is don't huddle together. They say spread out, because then it's, rather than having a whole group of people and something's happening, you spread out. You help out if there's people that need help. You can also, in your conversation, and I don't know if I agree with this, is be more aggressive, but one thing they say is, and this is for awareness, just not in the workplace. I mean, things are going on in movie theaters and malls and stuff. Do not pick up the weapon, because the police do not know who you are or if you are the aggressor. So those are kind of those points. Okay. Any questions on that? I think the timing's pretty good.
Where can people go? Where can attorneys go to find examples of policies and things that they should, like maybe like a form policy that they can bring to their office and use it to start, customizing for their own office, like something that they could use as a template for something.
Okay, so here's a couple things. Is you go to www.dir.ga.gov. That will give you the fact sheet on workplace violence prevention and in general. Then there is, let me see, I thought I had this up, template. Let me get the template. There is a template that the government provides for you, and it's the same thing. There is a model written workplace violence prevention plan, same thing. It's www.dir, which is the Department of Industrial Relations, .ga.gov. And just in Google, put workplace violence template, and it'll come up.
Great. Now, we have about another minute and a half here. I just want to find out from you, where do you think all this is headed ultimately? Where do you think there might be a national law, one across the United States, or will it always be a state-based thing? Or do you think that they'll get more severe or more relaxed as time goes on? What are your thoughts?
I think my thoughts is going to get more severe because there's more violence happening, more than we want. Every time I look at the news, something's happening out there, which is horrible. But I'm not sure it'll be a federal law. I think it's going to start out state by state, and more states will be coming up with it. The one thing that you have to understand, any laws out there, there's federal laws and state laws. And the firm has to follow the state laws, or whichever the one is the more severe. In other words, if there's no federal law on workplace violence prevention plan, then they have to look in the state. If the state's requiring it, then they have to go by the state. So you always have to follow the more, not severe, but the more
Stringent.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than federal minimum wage is low compared to California or other places. So you have to follow the state if it's more. Will federal? I don't know. That depends on what happens with the top brass and guns.
I guess it always does, doesn't it?
Yep. And the thing is, the only way to make everything better is, and this is for the owners of the attorney firms, everybody's watching your behavior. Okay, you are the one that is ultimately responsible for your employees and everybody that comes in it with every client. And they're going to be watching how you're responding. So, and it's a big job. It's hard. It's hard to be the owner at the top, but everybody's looking at you. So they're going to watch your behavior and act accordingly.
Great, that's wonderful. Just make sure you give people your contact information if they want more. They want to be able to contact you for more information.
So my email address is KUHELB as in boy or EEZ as in zebra @gmail.com. There is no E at the end of the Z. And I'm currently changing my domain for my website. So if you email me, I can then give you my website domain.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge today. I learned
Sure.
so much from what you had to say, and I really hope a lot of our listeners gain a lot from you too. So thank you
I
very much for
too.
being part
You're
of the discussion.
quite welcome. Thank you. And again, like I said, awareness is the key. All right.
Thank you very
Take care.
much.
Bye now.